Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Any here? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya'i wal Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man ihtada bihadihi wa man istanna bi sunnatihi ila yawmiddin. Amma ba'd. First of all, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for doing this program. Why? Because such a long history and such a legacy of our beloved people of the past, the Anbiya alayhimu salatu wassalam, and the Sahaba radiallahu ajma'in, and after them, everyone who strived to protect Masjid al-Aqsa. It is impossible to talk about them in just half hour, in just 1 hour, 2 hours. But at least we will get a little glimpse of what it was like to liberate Masjid al-Aqsa and what we as Muslims should understand of the importance of Masjid al-Aqsa in our lives and in our belief in itself. As one of the speakers said that many times in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks about this holy land. So anyways, after Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, 53 years after Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he constructed the Dome of Rock. He constructed the Dome of Rock. And according to many riwayats, this Dome of Rock is the place where Prophet ﷺ, he was lifted to the heavens. And according to other riwayats, this is a place where he led all the Anbiya alayhimu salatu wasalam, as you will learn in detail later on, inshallah. So then after that, after Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, the Muslims were in charge for 456 years. After that, the Crusaders came and they took Masjid al-Aqsa, they took the lands of Jerusalem, and they were only able to hold on to it for 93 years. And after that, our hero that we're going to talk about, he took over and he conquered it. He liberated Masjid al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. And it was in the hands of Muslims for 761 years after that. So we can see that this was in the hands of Muslims way more than the hands of non-Muslims. And as our last speaker said, when the iman, when the a'mal of the ummah was strong, and as long as it was strong, Muslims were taking care of it. But when something slipped, when the iman slipped, when the a'mal of the ummah slipped, then it was taken away from us. Now is the chance again, inshallah, that our a'mal needs to be on level with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure, inshallah, and we will see the victory coming to us, inshallah. But anyways, once upon a time, there lived a king. He was a king, he was a liberator, he was a conqueror, he was a warrior, who was once asked, "Now why don't you smile?" He replied, that how can I smile? How can my food taste good? How can I drink nicely when Masjid al-Aqsa is in the hands of the non-Muslims? And he is the one who will be remembered because he is the one who strived to liberate it. And he liberated it for us Muslims. And after that, even the non-Muslims, Muslims also speak high of him, but even the non-Muslims speak high of him. He was a person that numbers never scared him. Europe threw everything at him and against him. But our hero, Salahudeen ibn Yusuf ibn Ayyub, also known as Salahudeen al-Ayubi, rahmatullah alayhi, he fulfilled the rights of jihad. He fulfilled the rights of this ummah. He was ready to sacrifice everything and anything for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And scholars say it was as though that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept him back from the greatest people after the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam, the Sahaba radhiyallahu ajma'in, just to liberate Masjid al-Aqsa many years after. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Holy Quran, وَجَزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ سَيِّئَةٌ مِثْلُهَا فَمَنْ عَفَا وَأَصْلَحَ فَأَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الظَّالِمِينَ. وَجَزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ سَيِّئَةٌ مِثْلُهَا. The recompense of evil is evil like it. But he who forgives and makes amends and does sulah, his rewards lies with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says after, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الظَّالِمِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like the oppressors. History tells us that Salahudeen, rahimahullah, on recapturing Jerusalem from the Crusaders, who 90 years before massacred and savagely treated its Muslims and Jewish inhabitants. After 93 years when he liberated it, a group of Latin women, they came to Salahudeen al-Ayubi rahimahullah, and they addressed him, they talked to him, and they said, "O Sultan, you see that we are leaving. Amongst us are mothers, wives, daughters, sisters. And we are leaving the soldiers with you in captivity. These men that you have with you in captivity, they are all our only supporting. They support us in everything. They are the ones who support us. They are our supporters in our lives. And if you take them from us, we will not be able to live without them." At this, Salahudeen al-Ayubi rahimahullah, he smiled and he gave orders that the sons and husbands of those women, they be set free. He even went further and he gave money to them, that you can use this money to come back on your own life, to help yourself settle again. Another French girl, she comes up to Salahudeen al-Ayubi rahimahullah, and she starts shouting at him. She starts saying, "You murderer, you have killed my father and captured both of my brothers. So there remains no one to support me." Our hero, Salahudeen al-Ayubi rahimahullah, he calmly orders her brothers to be set free. And he addressed this girl and he said to her that it was your father who started this war. And because of him, many innocent people were killed. The French girl looked at him in shame, and she was feeling remorseful and regretful of her rude language with such an honorable man. And with tears in her eyes, she said, "Ya Sultan, forgive me." Why? It was the people back home and the media who talked so rude about you, who talked so rude about Muslims, that I didn't find any other way but to address you in such a rude manner. But I have seen that now what you have done for me and how your character was towards me, you are the most honorable man in our eyes. And she goes further to say that may God curse the liars in our homelands who deceive us and depicted you as savages, as assassins who desecrated our holy lands. And we find no better introduction than these two stories of Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah, who showed the practical definition of Islam even after he conquered it. And this goes back to the ayah I was reciting in the beginning, وَجَزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ سَيِّئَةٌ مِثْلُهَا. He had 3 rules from this ayah. 1, aggression is to be met with equal resistance. Number 2, the limit set by Allah in punishment should not exceed. And number 3, to forgive and treat well the weakened people or the defeated is better than taking revenge. In fact, he used to say, Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah, that it is better for one to err in forgiveness, it is better for one to make a mistake to err in forgiveness than to be right in punishment. It is better for one to make a mistake in forgiveness than to be right in punishment. Abul Hasan Nadwi rahimahullah, he puts it in the following words. Abu Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah, he was a devout Muslim. The dominant notes of his character were an acute sense of justice, charitableness, tenderness, patience and courage. Salahuddin Ayubi's close partner and close minister, he used to say that he would always busy himself in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a lesson for us. If you want something out of this, inshallah, and whatever situation is going on, we all have to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in submission, in forgiveness, and in the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remembrance of Allah. Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub. Because with the remembrance of Allah, first of all, it will give us sakina, it will give us peace of mind. And second of all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ala inna nasrallahi qareeb. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in another ayah, haqqan alayna nasrul mu'mineen. It is our right, it is our duty to help the Muslims. Who was his mentor? Where did he get all of this from? It was a great man named Nuruddin Zengi, rahimahullah. He was a very pious, knowledgeable, and just ruler in Syria. And he strived for unity and he strived for justice. And he constantly battled against the Crusaders. In 1168, Nuruddin rahimahullah, he ordered for a special wooden mimbar to be placed in Masjid al-Aqsa whenever it was conquered. So he's already prepared for it. And he passed away in 1174. That was 569 years after Hijri. Salahuddin rahimahullah fulfilled his teacher's wishes later on. And when he liberated Masjid al-Aqsa, he got this very expensive mimbar to be placed in Masjid al-Aqsa. And Ibn Shaddad, he writes, Salahuddin rahimahullah was in fact a continuing miracle of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and a manifest sign of the truthfulness and authenticity of his message. And where was he from? Does anyone know?
Kurdistan.
He was from Kurdistan. He was a Kurd. And they felt that it was their duty, that they had to liberate their lands, because they felt that they, as an ummah, they need to protect the Masjid al-Aqsa. He was born in a fort. He was from the royal family. He was born in a fort in Tikrit. And his mother mentions that when I was pregnant with Salah, I saw in a dream that in my stomach I had a sword from the swords of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As they say, great men create great men. And this was the environment in which Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah, he grew up in. And it was said that there was never a day from the time he was growing up, because he was in a royal family, that the Crusaders and fighting against the Crusaders and jihad was not spoken about. But it was not only that. He was brought up in an extremely religious environment. And from a very early age, from 13 to 14 years old, Salahuddin rahimahullah, he became a Hafidh. He memorized the Holy Quran. And he was a Shafi'i at fiqh. And his greatest aspiration in life was not jihad. His greatest aspiration in life was to become a scholar of deen. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen him for something else. As Nuruddin, as-Salah will say that it is Nuruddin who modeled me. I modeled myself on the life of Nuruddin rahimahullah. And Nuruddin rahimahullah, from a young age, he understood and he realized the potential of Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah. And just at a tender age, when the crime in Damascus was rising, he made Salahuddin rahimahullah in charge of the police department. So Salahuddin, he was brought up in Kurdistan like any other Kurd youth, with normal schooling, conventional science and arts and warfare. And before he captured Egypt, as we will talk about later on, no one would have predicted that this young man, he would one day emerge as such a great leader and conquer Jerusalem. And no one thought that he would be a person, except his teacher, Nuruddin, who believed in him. No one ever thought that he would one day defend the religion of Islam. And he would achieve such a high achievement that until today, and inshallah until the day of Qiyamah, he will be talked about. Once the Crusaders, they started attacking Egypt. And the Egypt was run by the Fatimites, the Shias. So the king of Egypt, he cut a piece of hair from his wife's head and he sent it to Nuruddin Zengi, rahimahullah. And this was a sign that we are in trouble and we need some help. And Nuruddin, rahimahullah, he was not ready to help them. He was not ready to help them. But the uncle of Salahuddin, rahimahullah, he convinced Nuruddin that we should help them. So, with the uncle of Salahuddin, rahimahullah, he told Salahuddin to prepare to go to Egypt. We are going to go to Egypt and we are going to live there. And Salahuddin, his name was Shirku, or Shirkuddin. For short, they used to call him Shirku. And he didn't want to go there. Why? Because his aspiration was to become a scholar. And he had to stay around Nuruddin Zengi and other scholars in Syria and Damascus to achieve that. And number two, he thought that it was very dangerous and it will be fatal for him. So Ibn Shaddad, who was a trusted counselor to Salahuddin, rahimahullah, he writes that Salahuddin, he went to Egypt against his own will. And he used to say in the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, Asa an takrahu shay'an wa huwa khayrun lakum. That it may be that sometimes you do not like something, or something is going against plans, or something doesn't feel right to you, but in fact, in the long run, it's way better for you. And Salahuddin, of course, he was going to be one of the greatest leaders of this ummah. He was going to be great for the history. He was going to be someone who leave a legacy behind. And Salahuddin, rahimahullah, he did not only conquer Egypt, but he left a whole legacy. He changed the whole shape and whole landscape of Sham. With the help of Shirku and his army, they were able to get rid of the Crusaders. So Adid, who was the name of the leader of Egypt at that time, he remained the leader, and second in charge was Shirku. And after some time, Shirku passed away, and they decided that Salahudeen Ayubi rahimahullah, he will be the second most powerful person at that time in Egypt. So therefore, at a young, tender age, he was only 32 years at that time. Salahuddin became one of the leaders and one of the most powerful leaders of that time. And he really showed what a leader should be. When he came into power, everyone started loving him. He won their hearts through his compassion. And it is said that Salahuddin rahimahullah, after he came into power in Egypt, he changed his whole life completely. He gave his whole life for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He understood the amount of responsibility on his head. And all the leisures and all the pleasures of life became nothing to him. And Ibn Shaddad rahimahullah, he writes that no sooner had he assumed the rulership of Egypt than the world and its pleasures lost all significance in his eyes. With a heartfelt sense of gratitude for the favor bestowed upon him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he repented from all pleasures, from all sins, and he took a life of sweat and toil, which increased as the time went on. And when Nuruddin passed away, Syria became corrupted. And the leaders, they started having ties with the Crusaders. They started being on the Crusader side. And not only that, they started giving annual tributes to the Crusaders. And corruption was all around. But the people of Syria, they were used to a great, just, compassionate leader like Nuruddin. And they were disgusted by all of this corruption going around. So they turned to Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah and they pleaded to him to come and take over Syria. And this was when Salahuddin rahimahullah, he started his expedition. This is when he started his expedition and his achievements. And his aim was always to fight in the path of Allah. His aim was always a'la kalimatullah, to make sure the word of Allah will always stay high. And describing the enthusiasm of Salahuddin rahimahullah, Ibn Shaddad writes, fired with enthusiasm to wage war against the Crusaders, jihad was his favorite topic. And paying attention to anyone who spoke about jihad, he gladly abandoned his hearth and home. And he abandoned his family and children. He took a life in the camp where a wind could uproot his tent. Moving on. Salahuddin rahimahullah, when the siege of Acre occurred, his royal physician, he says that he would eat nothing and he would drink nothing except a few morsels of food which the physician demanded him to eat for his safety and for his health. And it was Friday and Sunday when this siege was going on, and he could not sleep. His whole mind was only towards the battlefield. And Salahuddin rahimahullah said that he spent most of his time convincing the Muslims and fighting against the Muslims to become united, so that as one powerful team they can be united in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they can rise and they can raise the kalima of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the lands. But as the corruption continued, the people of Syria at that time, before he took over Syria, they released a man called Reginald de Chatillon. And he was a man, 15 years, Nuruddin Zengi, he threw him in prison. And Nuruddin passed away while he was still in prison. When he came out, the first thing he did was to muster up an army against Salahudeen rahimahullah. Actually, no. He mustered up an army and he was marching towards Mecca. And he said that I will go to Mecca and I will bring the Kaaba to the ground. And then, na'udhu billah, he said, I will then go to Medina. And al-Iyadu billah, he says, I will take the camel herder from his grave. Al-Iyadu billah min dhalik. Speaking of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I will bring him back to my palace in Karak, which is in Jordan at the moment. And I will charge the Muslims to view his body. When Salahuddin heard this, what did he do? He took out his sword and he lifted them in the sky. And he says, by Allah, I will kill Reginald with my own hands. Because Salahuddin rahimahullah, he had great love for our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he dispatched an army under Husamuddin al-Lu'lu. Husamuddin, he took a navy. He annihilated and destroyed the army of Reginald. He captured his men and took them to Medina, where he executed them. Then the Muslims had a truce. And after 4 years, this truce was broken by none other than Reginald. He attacked a Muslim caravan traveling from Egypt to Syria. And Ibn Shaddad, he writes that this was a caravan of pilgrims. They came back from Hajj. And he attacked them. And some of the people in the caravan, they asked him for mercy. They asked him to release them. They asked him that they're innocent, they did nothing. And he says, go call your Muhammad to release you, to rescue you. Al-Iyadu billah min dhalik. And when Salahuddin rahimahullah heard this, once again, so 2 times, once again he took out his sword and he lifted it in his skies and he says, by Allah, I will kill Reginald with my own hands. It is on this occasion that Salahuddin brought forth an army. And this was the famous battle of Hittin. Hittin was in Palestine and in the neighborhood of Tibris. On the 25th Rabiul Akhir, 583 years after Hijri, or 1187. And this army gave a death blow to the Crusaders, and it was a clear victory for Muslims. Salahuddin rahimahullah, he consulted his men and he talked to them. He asked them, should we continue targeting their forts and their palaces? They said, yes, we should continue targeting their forts and their palaces. But Salahuddin rahimahullah said, no, we will start taking them head on, because, and this is a lesson to learn, none of us knows when we will die. We do not know when we will die, and it is better dying saving the kalima of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in this country, it is our duty to do the da'wah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to give da'wah to everyone we see. That's our responsibility and our duty. That we live ourselves as Muslims, we have an identity of Islam, we do the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do. And whenever we are in our workplaces, in the superstores, wherever we are Muslim first. We promote the identity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is our responsibility, that is our duty. He said, O my men, please fight, do not fight for me, fight for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Second lesson we learn, that whatever we do, we need to relate it back to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the first 3 people we learn from the hadith, the first 3 categories of people that will be dragged into Jahannam will be those people who did things seemingly for the sake of Allah, seemingly for the deen, but they did it for a warrior, he did it to be called brave. For the scholar, he did it to be called knowledgeable. For the person who's generous, he did it to be called generous, not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they rechecked their intentions. And the Crusaders' army was considerably larger than the army of Muslims. They were deeply entrenched and they barricaded themselves. But Salahuddin rahimahullah, he showed what a genius, what a military genius he was. He went to a nearby fort, and they had the militaries, they had their wives and their mothers and the children and so on there. So he laid siege to that fort. And he went to the fort in such a way that he was back in the sea. So from the seaside, that's where he laid the siege. And the opposition, they thought that we will have a full force towards him and we will throw them into the sea. But Salahuddin wanted them to think exactly like that, because it was midsummer and the Crusaders, they had something called the True Cross, and they believed that this True Cross was part of al-Ayubi, was a very precious, and they even thought that the previous battles they won, it was because of the barakah, the blessings of this cross. So they brought their cross with them. And they believed that as long as we have this cross, we will even win over the Muslims. So when they marched towards Salahuddin rahimahullah, he already had it planned out. He put so many archers on either side of their march that when they started marching towards the Muslims and toward the fort, that the archers, they started attacking, and so many of them, and they were killed, and it made the army progress at snail pace. It became very slow, and it happened. It was so devastating to them that they started wishing that night will fall, so that the fighting usually didn't go on in the night. From the Muslims' camp, there were of someone reciting Quran. There was cries of someone doing dhikr. But on the side of the kuffar, there were cries of wounds. The wind blew it towards the camp of the Crusaders. And there the Muslims attacked. And they were saying, وَكَانَ حَقًّا عَلَيْنَا نَصْرُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And here Salahuddin rahimahullah, he afflicted the final physical blow. And that was to capture the True Cross. And he sent a powerful group to capture this cross from them. And 150 men only. Everyone else were either killed or they ran away. Only 150 men remained with the king and the cross. And the Muslims attacked. And Salahuddin, he was with his brother. His brother says to him that Muslims are victorious. And Salahuddin rahimahullah says, not yet. Not yet. And then they captured the True Cross and they brought it back to the Muslims. And again, his brother says that Muslims are victorious. Salahuddin rahimahullah says, not yet, until the tent of the king is not destroyed and does not fall, we're not victorious. And at that same moment, the tent fell. And what did Salahuddin Ayubi rahimahullah do? Did he start dancing? Did he start listening to music and jumping up? No. He fell straight into sajda. And he fell straight into sajda, thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he praised Allah. And he understood that victory is from Allah and also defeat is from Allah. After 2 days, Salahuddin, he did not stop there. He continued and he went to the north of Acre. And it is said, Imam Dhahabi rahimahullah, he writes, it's very profound, that this was the greatest victory since Khalid ibn Walid when he defeated the Romans in the Battle of Yarmouk. Salahuddin rahimahullah. 2 days after, he continued. And he took over places like Turan, Haifa, Arsuf, Beirut, Nablus, and many others. And one thing he did, he took over all the ports. Why? This stopped the Crusaders from entering again. So there could be no reinforcements. Salahuddin then, after he protected all of the ports, now he's marching towards his greatest aim. and his greatest intention of his life. That was the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa. Someone asked him at this time, which I said at the beginning, that you are the king of Egypt, you are the king of Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and many other places and cities. You rarely smile. And at this point, he said, how can I smile when Bayt al-Maqdis is still in the hands of the Crusaders? For 5 days, Salahuddin rahimullah, he laid siege around Jerusalem. On the 20th of Rajab, they found an ideal place to lay siege. For 6 days straight, they pounded the city. And on the 26th of Rajab, Balian, who was the spokesperson, he was one of the leaders of the Crusaders, he came out to ask for terms. And Salahuddin rahimullah, he says to him that from beginning I asked you for terms, but you didn't listen. Now you have to face it. But Balian said, if you do not take terms, then all of the Muslims that are in Jerusalem, 5,000 plus, we will kill all of them. But Salahuddin al-Ayubi rahimahullah, he could have easily said, go ahead, see what we will do to you. But he remembered the history. He remembered that for 93 years, the Muslims are being massacred. The Muslims are being tortured and they're being oppressed. So he agreed to the terms. And after that, Salahuddin rahimahullah, he entered Jerusalem in a very special night. According to some very weak riwayats, this was the night when our beloved Prophet Muhammad went up to the heavens. When he entered Masjid al-Aqsa, and then he went up to the heavens. Laylatul Mi'raj. It's from weak ahadith, but nevertheless, Salahuddin Ayyubi on the 27th Rajab, he entered Masjid al-Aqsa, and Masjid al-Aqsa was liberated. Now, they could have remembered the people, the Muslims entering. They could have remembered the 70,000 worshippers that were killed at once in Masjid al-Aqsa. They could have remembered the mothers who had their babies in their hands. They were snatched away from them and they were abducted. And they could remember all the tortures and all the killings and all the massacres that have been happening for the last 90 years. But Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah, he had a greater history in mind. He had a greater picture in mind. And his picture was at the time of the conquest of Mecca. When the Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'in, they were entering Mecca. They could have pictured Bilal radiallahu anh being dragged in the scorching heat on the earth until his skin started to peel. They could have pictured Unaysa and Lubayna being martyred. They could have pictured Yasir and Sumayya and his family being martyred, and all of the other issues that went on with the Muslims at that time. And they remembered it until one Sahabi, he says, Al-Yawmu Yawmul Malhama, today is the day of revenge. Today is the day of recompense. Today is the day that we will take over them and we will kill them. Prophet ﷺ overheard this and he says, no, today is the day of mercy. Today is the day of forgiveness. Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimullah, he stands up and he makes an announcement that today is the day, not a day of recompense. Today is the day of mercy and forgiveness. Just like my Habib sallallahu alayhi wasallam said. And most of the people, except 200 Templars and the one Reginald, they were captured and they were brought to the tent of Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah and the king of Jerusalem at that time. So the king of Jerusalem, the 200 Templars and Reginald, the 200 Templars were executed. Now left with in the tent of Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah was the king of Jerusalem at that time and Reginald. So on seeing the king and his thirst and his face, Salahuddin offered him some ice cold water and he drank it. And after he drank it, he passed it on to Reginald. And Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah, he was very annoyed by this. And he told him that you are the one who gave him the water. It meant, if someone gives you water, it meant that you are at peace with him. You are safe with him. And he's protected. But Salahudeen Ayubi rahimahullah, he says, you give him the water. I did not give him. And Salahudeen Ayubi rahimahullah, Ibn Shaddad rahmatullah alayhi, he writes that Salahudeen offered Reginald Islam. That accept Islam and everything will be squared. Everything will be forgiven. And Reginald, he said, no, I'm not going to accept Islam. And Salahudeen Ayubi rahimahullah, he says that I made an oath 2 times. I swore by Allah 2 times. And he reminded him of those 2 times. That I would kill you with my own hands. And at that moment, he takes out his sword and he finishes him. And after that, history testifies. Until 671 years, until 1948, all of the Muslims, non-Muslims, everyone was living at peace and in terms. And he created an environment of justice, of compassion. And he showed the ummah the real meaning of being a real leader. And he showed an ummah the real meaning of adopting the justice, just like Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, as the speaker before talked about. He adopted. And until 1948, when Jerusalem was once again taken out of the hands of Muslims. At the moment, we can pray in there, but it's not in our hands. From 1948 until now. It's not in our hands. There are hundreds of guards around there, making sure that no Palestinian youth under the age of 18, around the age of 18, enters it. Why? Because it's in their control. And one scholar, and I will finish with this, he writes that as long as the ummah are with he says that Mecca and Medina, they are protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we learn from the Ashabul Fil, Abraha, when he marched towards Mecca, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dealt with him. So he says that Mecca and Medina is protected divinely. But Masjid al-Aqsa is not protected divinely. It depends on the a'mal of the ummah, and accordingly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect Masjid al-Aqsa. So our duty, after learning the life of Umar radiallahu anhu, after learning the life of Salahudeen rahimahullah, is to, one of their main components that helped them throughout their whole journey was the submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, it is said about Salahudeen rahimahullah that he didn't live in a home, he wasn't close to a masjid, but never ever he missed a salah with jama'ah. Never missed a salah with jama'ah. And it would say, and it is written, that whenever he heard a hadith, he would never listen to it standing up. Because of the love of Prophet, he understood it to be disrespectful to listen to a hadith standing up. So if someone wanted to say a hadith of Prophet, he would make everyone sit and he would listen to the hadith. And he would love the people of the Quran. He will love the scholars. And it is our duty that we turn back towards the masajid. It is our duty to give the dawah as much as possible to the non-Muslims. It is our duty that living here, that we raise the kalima la ilaha illallah as much as we can. And how can we do this? First, we ourselves need to turn back to the masajid, inshallah. We ourselves need to turn back to the Quran. We need to turn back to the sunnah of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like Salahudeen Ayubi rahimahullah did. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the understanding. Jazakallahu khairan.